The mansion rose imposingly at the top of a hill, surrounded by tall walls and iron gates that rarely opened. Behind that fortress of luxury lived a man who, to many, seemed to have everything anyone could desire: wealth, beauty, and a body sculpted by years of discipline and training. Yet the truth hidden under that silent roof was that he lacked the most important thing: the ability to see life with his own eyes. The accident that had taken his sight had also stolen his hope, his faith in love, and his joy of living. Now, trapped in his own darkness, he spent his days walking through silent corridors, where only the sound of his cane striking the floor echoed as a cruel reminder of all he had lost. Before the accident, he was known as a dazzling man, courted by women and envied by other men. His presence at any social event attracted stares and whispers. The fortune inherited from his family, multiplied by his sharp intelligence in business, only reinforced the image of someone untouchable, a true modern prince. But since the darkness had closed over his eyes, he had withdrawn from the world. He avoided visitors, rejected invitations, and the few employees who still worked in his mansion saw him as a severe, cold, and bitter master. No trace remained of the charming man who once smiled for camera flashes and raised glasses at luxurious dinners. What no one knew was that, more than his sight, what had truly been taken from him was trust. He no longer believed anyone could ever love him for real. To him, every woman who had once sought him out had been drawn by his looks or his wealth. Without his outward beauty, without the charm of eyes that once captivated, he believed nothing about him could inspire genuine love. He lived as a prisoner within himself, feeding the idea that love was nothing more than an illusion created to disguise self-interest. His routine was marked by silence. The employees, intimidated by his arrogance, kept their distance. Meals were served without words, the corridors cleaned without anyone daring to disturb his introspection. He spent hours locked away in his library, surrounded by books he could no longer read, listening only to the sound of an old record player that repeated melancholic melodies. There, lost in the shadows, he convinced himself that living alone was better than being exposed once again to life's cruel illusions. Yet, in the midst of that gloomy isolation, one detail began to torment him. The mansion itself, once a symbol of luxury and power, now felt suffocating. It was as if the walls screamed his loneliness and echoed his deepest fears. He had become the ghost of his own house, wandering the corridors with steady steps, but without direction. The pride that had once been his signature was now nothing more than armor to hide the pain of losing what had given his life meaning. And as the days dragged on, he nurtured the certainty that nothing and no one could ever return the light to him. This was the portrait of the millionaire who, hidden behind darkness and arrogance, believed himself condemned to live without love. What he could never imagine was that life was already preparing an encounter with someone who, without conventional beauty, without wealth or titles, carried within her the only thing capable of giving him back the most important vision, the vision of the heart. That grey morning, the mansion looked even more imposing and distant from reality. The iron gate opened slowly, and through it walked a woman with hesitant steps, yet filled with determination. She was the new maid, hired almost in haste by the housekeeper who managed the household routine. She carried with her a simple bag, modest clothes, and a curious gaze, though weighed down by nervousness. Her life up to that point had been marked by daily struggles, by the veiled discrimination she had endured everywhere she went, and by the lack of opportunities that society stubbornly denied to those who, like her, did not fit the imposed standards of beauty or wealth. She was a black woman, overweight, and her appearance carried the marks that the world used as an excuse to judge her. Yet within her, there was a quiet sweetness, a genuine humility, and a strength hidden behind the timid smile she insisted on offering, even when the world seemed determined to crush her. As she crossed the luxurious courtyard, she could not help but feel the weight of inequality: red carpets, expensive sculptures, and architecture that exuded ostentation. It was as if she had entered a completely different universe, one to which she did not seem to belong. Upon being led into the main hall, she met the housekeeper, a stern woman with a proud bearing, who scrutinized her from head to toe with a critical eye. The housekeeper wasted no time making it clear that the job would not be easy, that the master was a difficult man, demanding and, above all, merciless with mistakes. The new maid listened in silence, swallowing the anxiety rising inside her. After all, this was her chance to support her family, to secure the minimum dignity for herself, and to prove that despite constant rejection, she had worth. It was in that moment that destiny chose to reveal itself. The firm sound of a cane echoed through the corridors before he entered the room. The blind millionaire appeared with heavy steps, dressed in an immaculate shirt, exuding authority. Even without sight, it was as if he could impose his presence on anyone who dared to breathe near him. Upon hearing that there was a new employee, he raised his chin and let out a voice that was cold, almost cutting. He wanted to make it clear from the very first moment that he needed no one and was not interested in small talk or kindness. She, intimidated, lowered her eyes, as she always did when facing scorn. Her heart raced and her hands trembled, yet she stood firm. She replied in a calm voice, promising dedication and respect, even knowing she would not receive the same in return. He, however, released a bitter laugh, as if it were impossible to believe that someone like her could make any difference in his life. That first encounter was marked by shock and rejection. He did not want anyone in his routine, much less someone he deemed incapable of understanding his pain. To him, the new maid was nothing more than another shadow in the house, destined to disappear before his arrogance. To her, however, that moment would be the beginning of an unexpected path, a path where her humility would face the darkness of the heart of a man who believed he had already lost the ability to love. The days following the new maid's arrival were marked by a silent tension that lingered through the corridors of the mansion. Every movement she made seemed to disturb the master, who, even without sight, had an acute sensitivity to notice the presence of anyone around him. He perceived the sound of her hesitant steps, the delicate scrape of objects she carefully cleaned, and even the contained sigh when she thought no one could hear her. To him, it was invasive, almost as if the silence he had chosen to live in was under threat. For her, every minute in that house was a test of endurance, for it was not enough to simply perform her duties. She had to endure the invisible arrows of scorn that struck her at every moment. He was harsh in his words, often too sharp in his orders, as if her presence were a constant nuisance. If she took a little longer to tidy a room, he would immediately make a cutting remark, insinuating he might have chosen the wrong person for the job. When she offered help beyond what was asked of her, he rejected it with coldness, stating that he needed no one's pity. Every sentence of his was like a wall built between them, and she, though wounded by that disdain, always responded with respect, swallowing the grief that burned inside her. The other servants, already accustomed to the master's difficult temperament, found in that situation one more reason to ridicule her. Between whispers and disguised laughter, they said she would not last long, that a woman like her would never have the strength to withstand the pressure of working there. Some even mocked her appearance, suggesting she was unfit to be in such a luxurious mansion. She listened in silence, pretended not to care, but inside each word was a dagger cutting into her self-esteem, already scarred by years of rejection. Even so, something inside her kept her firm. Perhaps it was the need to provide for her family, perhaps the desire to prove to herself that she was capable, or perhaps it was a strange intuition that this place, hostile as it was, still held something greater for her life. She could not explain it, but there was an inner voice telling her not to give up. He, on the other hand, could not understand how that woman had not yet abandoned the job. He was used to seeing people give up in the face of his coldness, but she remained there day after day, enduring not only his hostility, but also the hidden cruelty of the others. Deep down, though he would never admit it, that persistence was beginning to stir something within him. It was as if the mansion, accustomed to being a stage of shadows, was slowly beginning to receive a new presence, a discreet but constant force that he could not ignore. The clash between their worlds, his, shaped by darkness and pride, and hers, forged in humility and resilience, did not seem, at first glance, capable of producing any closeness. But life, with its silent irony, was already preparing the ground so that from that collision, something unexpected could emerge. Something neither he, in his arrogance, nor she, in her simplicity, could ever imagine. The days went by slowly, weighed down by the silent routine of the mansion, but little by little, something began to change. The millionaire, long accustomed to completely ignoring the presence of the new maid, began to notice details that once would have slipped past him. He realized, for instance, that the rooms of the house were more organized than before, that the meals carried a subtle touch of seasoning that awakened forgotten memories, and that the objects in the library, where he spent most of his time, were always carefully realigned, as if someone there truly cared about every detail of his life. At first, he refused to give it importance. His arrogance prevented him from admitting that somehow the woman's dedication was interfering with his routine. But what truly began to capture his attention was not the flawless execution of her tasks, but rather the sensitivity hidden in simple gestures. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried a sincerity he had not heard in a very long time. There was no flattery, no hidden interest, only a disarming, direct truth that gradually seeped through the cold armor he had built around himself. Once, after complaining about a meal that did not please him, he expected her to bow her head as everyone always had. Instead, she replied calmly, saying she could prepare it again, but respectfully reminding him that perhaps the problem was not the dish itself, but the fact that he no longer found pleasure in anything. Those simple words struck deep. He was not used to being confronted in such an honest way. For the first time in years, he did not know how to respond. It was also on a quiet afternoon that he noticed something else. While tidying the music room, she softly hummed a gentle melody, almost like a whisper. He, who had come to hate music because it reminded him of the days when he could still see, stood still, silently listening to that delicate sound. Without realizing it, his lips curved into a faint smile, almost imperceptible, but real. It was as if that voice had brought back a timid light to a hardened heart. Little by little, the mansion began to fill with invisible signs of her presence. He, who once saw her only as a nuisance, began to perceive something different, not with his eyes, but with his heart. Her humility had a strength he could not explain. She needed no ornate words, no grand gestures. It was enough for her to simply be herself, and that authenticity, so rare in a world where everyone sought something from him, began to transform him from within. The millionaire still did not admit it to himself, but he could no longer ignore the feeling that, for the first time since losing his sight, someone truly saw the man behind the wealth and arrogance. The new maid, with her simplicity and silent courage, was revealing an invisible worth he had never imagined he would find. On a night of heavy rain, the millionaire wandered restlessly through the mansion's library. He could not sleep, as usual, tormented by the memories of the accident that had taken his sight and by the constant emptiness that consumed him. As he walked in circles, leaning on his cane, he heard discreet footsteps in the corridor, and then the soft voice of the new maid, asking if he needed anything. At first he reacted coldly, saying it was unnecessary, but there was something different about that night. Perhaps it was the weight of loneliness, perhaps the vulnerability hidden behind his facade of arrogance. Whatever it was, against his own will, he did not send her away. She entered the library respectfully and noticed his restlessness. Instead of offering material help like water or forced company, she simply asked, "You can't sleep either, sir?" That simple, almost innocent question unsettled him. No one had ever dared speak to him so directly, as if he were just a man and not an untouchable figure. Without realizing it, he replied with sincerity, "No, there are nights when the darkness feels heavier than during the day." It was the first time he admitted something so intimate out loud. The conversation flowed naturally. In a few words, he told her about the silence that had overtaken his life since the accident. She, in turn, spoke about her own struggles, about how she had learned to survive in a world that constantly judged her by her appearance. "Sometimes, I think being invisible hurts more than being rejected," she said, unaware of the impact those words would have on him. For the first time, he felt that someone understood his pain, not because they knew his wealth or fame, but because they shared an invisible wound. That night, he not only heard, but listened, and every sentence from her seemed to light up a forgotten corner of his soul. Her tone carried no interest, no pity. It carried only truth. It was as if, finally, someone dared speak to him without masks. He realized that through her words, he could see again something he had long forgotten: humanity. At the end of the conversation, when she stood up to leave, he stopped her, asking her to stay a little longer. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. On the contrary, there was a strange peace in that moment. For the first time in a very long while, the millionaire fell asleep without the weight of loneliness, lulled by the sound of the simple voice of that woman who, without knowing it, was beginning to bring light into his heart. The morning after that night of unexpected conversations, something inside the millionaire felt different. He did not want to admit it to himself, but he had awakened lighter, as if a small flame had been lit in the midst of darkness. Still, he kept his rigid posture, as though afraid of revealing any weakness. It was during an ordinary afternoon, while walking through the corridors of the mansion, that destiny prepared him for a transformative experience. He walked with firm steps, guided by his cane, when he stumbled on a small object left in his path. His body faltered, and for a moment, it seemed he would fall to the ground. Before that could happen, she, who was nearby, ran to hold his arm firmly. The contact was unexpected. Her hand, warm and steady, met his, which was used only to the cold of the cane's metal. Surprised, he tried to pull away, but she, concerned, insisted on supporting him until he was steady. That touch, seemingly simple, unleashed a whirlwind of sensations. For someone who lived immersed in darkness, touch was the only bridge to perceive the world, and in that instant, his skin recognized something his eyes would never see: genuine care. Embarrassed, she apologized, saying she had not meant to invade his space. But for the first time, he did not respond with coldness. Instead, he kept his hand on hers for a few seconds longer, as if wanting to memorize that silent gesture of protection. From that day on, small situations began to repeat themselves. When he needed to climb stairs or navigate difficult corridors, it was her hand that guided him. When he sat at the table, it was she who carefully adjusted his utensils, always respecting his space, yet transmitting confidence through the simple act of touch. And he began to realize that life, even in darkness, could still be felt intensely. There was a special moment when, without realizing it, he asked her to describe the mansion's garden. Instead of merely using words, she took his hand and guided it over the petals of a flower, letting him feel its softness and texture. He smiled, something rare for him, and said it was the first time in years he could imagine colors. For her, hearing that felt like receiving a gift. For him, it was proof that vision was not only in the eyes, but also in the heart and in hands capable of transmitting sensitivity. Her touch, which had begun as a simple gesture of care, became a silent bond between them. Through that contact, he felt secure, and through that gesture, she realized she could show that her worth was not in the appearance so often judged by others, but in the essence that only true eyes could recognize. As the relationship between the millionaire and the new maid began to take on shades of trust and closeness, the atmosphere in the mansion became increasingly hostile toward her. The other employees, long accustomed to dealing with the cold and inaccessible master, looked on in astonishment at the way he now accepted her presence and even sought, albeit discreetly, her company. This contrast sparked not only curiosity, but also envy and disdain. What had once been whispers scattered through the corridors now became bolder, malicious remarks, spoken almost on purpose so that she could hear them. The mockery grew harsher. Some laughed at her appearance, insinuating that she could never be worthy of the attention of a rich and handsome man. Others accused her of trying to take advantage of his blindness, as if her dedication were part of a scheme to benefit from the master's fortune. And there were still those who simply treated her as if she were invisible, ignoring her presence during quick staff meetings or collective tasks in the house, reinforcing her feeling of exclusion. Inside, she felt every one of those wounds. The prejudice that had followed her outside the mansion gates now revealed itself inside the very house where she sought work and dignity. Yet, instead of reacting with anger, she kept her head held high and continued her duties with the same dedication as always. She knew that giving in to provocation would only confirm what they said about her, that she did not belong there. Still, There were nights when she cried alone in the small room reserved for the staff, asking herself how much longer she would have the strength to endure. The millionaire, though blind to the mocking looks and smirks, sensed the different weight in the air whenever she entered a room. He felt the hesitation in her voice, the longer silences, and even the change in the tone of the other employees when she was near. One evening at dinner, he noticed she was unusually quiet, answering only with "yes, sir" or "no, sir." Something was wrong. Then, when everyone had left the room, he asked, "Why do you seem to carry a burden you won't tell me about?" She hesitated, but replied only that she was fine because she was already used to being judged. Those words struck him like an invisible blow. For the first time, he realized that beyond his own pain, there was someone before him who faced the daily burden of being rejected simply for who she was. And yet, unlike him, she did not allow herself to sink into resentment. She endured in silence, without losing her dignity. That realization began to awaken in him a new feeling, a mixture of respect and admiration that deepened into something stronger with each passing day. Inside the mansion, prejudice acted like a storm, trying to extinguish the timid flame rising between them. But what no one expected was that her resistance in the face of cruelty would be the very fuel that made this love grow stronger, breaking through barriers that once seemed insurmountable. The transformation did not happen all at once, but in small subtleties that, for those who observed closely, were clear signs that something inside him was shifting. The millionaire, once always locked in his world of silence and bitterness, began to show behaviors no one expected. He, who used to ignore conversations and respond coldly to any attempt at closeness, started asking questions. Simple at first, about the weather, about how the house was organized, but they carried a sincere curiosity, as if he had rediscovered the pleasure of dialogue. Little by little, his rigidity gave way to unexpected gestures. One morning, he asked her to describe the colors of the dress she was wearing, even knowing he could not see them. He wanted to see through her words. On another occasion, he asked her to tell him about her childhood, about what she dreamed of when she was still a little girl. He listened attentively, and when she spoke, it was clear that he was not a master looking for distraction, but a man eager to dive into a life that was not his own. The employees, accustomed to seeing him as a distant boss, began to find his behavior strange. Some whispered that he was becoming soft, that his blindness had made him vulnerable, or worse, that the new maid was enchanting him. But for him, none of that mattered. For the first time since the accident, he felt the desire to live, to step outside of himself and reach for something greater than his own suffering. She also noticed the changes. She saw how, when walking, he no longer relied so heavily on his cane, preferring instead to trust the hand she offered. She noticed the timid smiles that appeared when she absent-mindedly hummed a song, and she sensed that, within those small transformations, a man was being reborn. Deep down, she feared what it meant. The closer he drew, the more she found herself facing the possibility of something she had never imagined, being loved by someone the whole world believed to be unreachable. A remarkable moment happened one afternoon in the garden. He asked her to guide him there, saying he wanted to smell the flowers he had not seen in years. When they arrived, he knelt before a rose bush and asked her to describe every detail: the petals, the stem, the shade of red. With a trembling voice, she described them with such emotion that he felt as if he could see again. Then, with a sincerity that made her shiver, he murmured, "If I could see right now, I am certain the world would have your shape." From that instant on, there was no longer any denying it. He was changing. The cold man, locked in his own darkness, was beginning to bloom again. And the reason was not his fortune, nor his appearance. It was her, the humble woman, who, without realizing it, was giving him back his life, showing that sometimes the greatest wealth is not in what the eyes capture, but in what the heart recognizes. The bond between them, once sustained only by necessity and respect, began to take on deeper shades. There were no declarations, no grand gestures, yet the silence between the two already said everything. The millionaire, who had once seen the mansion as a cold prison, now looked forward to the moments when she entered a room. The simple sound of her voice filled the empty spaces, and even the sound of her footsteps had become a kind of discreet music, capable of calming his restless soul. The conversations, once short and formal, stretched late into the night. He wanted to hear about the places she had gone to as a child, about the stories from her neighborhood, about the dreams she had kept to herself. Every detail she shared was absorbed with intensity, as if, through her, he could live experiences that darkness had denied him. In return, he opened up as well. He spoke about the weight of losing not only his sight, but also his trust in people. He revealed fears he had never shared with anyone, showing himself to be human, fragile, and deeply in need of affection. There were subtle moments that marked the blossoming of this love. One afternoon, as she read aloud a passage from an old book in the library, she noticed him smiling faintly, as though the words gained new life through the way she pronounced them. On another occasion, while guiding him through the garden, their fingers accidentally intertwined, yet neither rushed to let go. The touch lasted longer than it should have, and in that silent instant, both felt something that no words could ever translate. For her, the discovery of this feeling was as beautiful as it was painful. Deep down, she believed she was unworthy of such love. The prejudice she had carried all her life whispered that a woman like her could never be chosen by a man like him. But at the same time, every gesture of his showed her that the heart could see beyond appearances. For him, the transformation was even more profound. It was not only about learning to smile again, but about realizing that he could trust, that he had found in someone invisible to society the truest presence in his life. The mansion, once inhabited by shadows, was now the setting for subtle moments of tenderness. There were no kisses, no promises, yet love was already blooming there, silent and overwhelming, growing between two worlds that should never have met, but now seemed destined for one another. The love that was being born between them was pure and true, but the world outside the silent bubble of the mansion did not take long to impose its cruelty. Society, always attentive to details it does not understand, began whispering about the unlikely closeness between the blind millionaire and the humble maid. The rumors started discreetly, but quickly spread through social circles that, even without living directly with him, never missed the chance to comment on the life of the wealthy and desired man. The cruelty of words spared no one. They said that because he was blind, he had allowed himself to be deceived. They insinuated that she was taking advantage of his disability and his fortune. Some openly laughed at the possibility of such a handsome, muscular man falling in love with a black woman, overweight and considered by society as outside the standards. It's impossible for that to be love, they said, as if true feeling had to obey rules dictated by appearance. The mansion's employees, fed by envy and the venom of the outside world, reinforced these prejudices inside the house. With every gesture of closeness between master and maid came mocking looks, stifled laughter, and even malicious comments left hanging in the air, like invisible thorns planted to wound in silence. She endured everything quietly, but in her heart, the pain grew like an open wound. It was not enough to fear she was unworthy of that love. Now there was also the cruel voice of the world telling her there was no place for her at his side. The millionaire, though he could not see the malicious looks, noticed the difference in tones of voice, the silences heavy with poison, and the sadness that began to weigh on her. He noticed how, little by little, her discreet laughter was fading, as though prejudice was suffocating the light she had once brought into his life. When he asked if she was all right, she replied with a forced smile and said yes, but her heart could no longer hide the truth. The nights that had once been filled with light-hearted conversations now became silent. She avoided drawing near, fearing that he would suffer even more if he surrendered to a love the world insisted on ridiculing. It was as if she were being pushed out of his life by the invisible force of prejudice. And though he was beginning to realize it, he still did not know how far she was willing to go in sacrificing her own happiness to spare him from social humiliation. The weight of discrimination fell upon them like a cold storm, testing not only the love that blossomed, but also the strength of each of them. For her, it was the moment to confront the fear of never being enough. For him, it was the proof that the heart sees far beyond the eyes, even when the world refuses to believe it. The pressures that had once been only whispers began to grow unbearable. The maid, who already carried the scars of a lifetime of discrimination, now felt the doubled weight of being at the center of judgmental eyes. Every time she went out into the streets, she heard whispers and felt glances of disdain. Inside the mansion, the hostility of the other employees never ceased, and the feeling of not belonging to that world became a burden, increasingly heavy to bear. What consumed her most, however, was not the prejudice directed at herself, but the pain of imagining how much it could wound the man she loved. He, who had already suffered so much from the loss of his sight, now became the target of cruel jokes. They said his blindness prevented him from realizing who was truly at his side. For her, each word was like a blade cutting her from within. She did not want to be the reason for more suffering. She did not want his name to be tarnished for standing beside someone the world insisted on calling unworthy. One night, while he rested after a long day, she sat in her small room and wept silently. Between sobs, she made a decision that broke her heart. She had to leave. She believed that by walking away, she would protect him from society's scorn and from the cruelty of those who refused to accept their love. She wrote a short letter where she thanked him for the trust, for the opportunity to work, and above all, for the moments they had shared. She did not dare write the word love, for she feared staining the purity of the feeling with painful goodbyes. The next morning, she packed her few clothes into the simple bag with which she had arrived. She walked through the mansion's hallways one last time, touching the walls discreetly, as if she wished to keep every memory of her days there. When she reached the gate, she stopped for a moment and looked back. Her heart screamed for her to stay, but reason whispered that leaving was the only path. With tears in her eyes, she crossed the gate and disappeared along the silent road, leaving behind not only a job, but also the part of herself she had discovered inside that house. When the millionaire awoke and noticed her absence, he was overtaken by a devastating sense of emptiness. The silence that had once been only routine now became unbearable. He called her name, waited for an answer, but all he heard was the echo of his own solitude. Upon finding the letter abandoned on his desk, his hands trembled as they touched the paper. The simple words she had left were like invisible daggers, tearing from him something he had never felt before: the pain of losing not only a worker, but the only person who had given him a reason to live again. She had left believing she was doing the right thing, but what she did not know was that at that very moment, he was beginning to realize the true dimension of what he felt for her. Her absence was not merely uncomfortable, it was unbearable. Her departure opened inside the millionaire an emptiness that no fortune, no luxury, and no silence could ever fill. For the first time since the accident, he felt the true pain of being completely alone. Before, his solitude had been a choice. He withdrew from people to avoid disappointment, to shield himself from life's cruel judgment. Now, however, solitude was a punishment, an unbearable weight crushing every corner of his soul. He spent days wandering through the mansion like a ghost, calling for her in the hallways, hoping to hear the voice that once warmed his days. But there was only silence. The food, which had once gained flavor from her hands, now tasted bland. The music, which had once regained meaning when she hummed, became again a painful reminder of all he had lost. Even the flowers in the garden, which she had described with such care, no longer had fragrance for him. Nothing made sense anymore. The pride that had always sustained him began to crumble. He, who had always refused to admit weakness, was now broken. On sleepless nights, he sat in the library with the letter in his hands, repeating the short words she had left behind. He tried to find in them some sign that she felt the same, but the silence of the lines tore tears from him, tears he had never allowed himself to shed in front of anyone. Despair consumed him. He summoned drivers, asked the staff for information, demanded that they discover where she had gone, but no one knew, or pretended not to know. He then decided that, even without sight, he needed to find her. He took his cane, guided himself along the mansion walls, and with a courage he had never imagined he possessed, stepped out through the gate. Each step into the outside world was a challenge, but the pain of her absence was far greater than the fear of the darkness. Deep down, he knew. It was no longer just gratitude, no longer just companionship. What he felt was love. A love so profound it crossed all barriers, a love that made him realize that without her by his side, life would cease to make sense. His despair was not that of a master who had lost a servant, but of a man who had lost the woman who had given him life again. And as he walked with uncertain steps, he repeated to himself an inescapable truth. He needed to find her. He needed to tell her that he loved her. Because now there was no more doubt. The true blindness was not of the eyes, but of a heart that had taken too long to realize who truly illuminated his soul. He searched for her tirelessly, guided only by his heart and the memory of her voice. The darkness didn't matter. The obstacles didn't matter. Every step was driven by the certainty that only by finding that woman again could he truly live. And fate, which so often seemed cruel, finally decided to unite them once more. After days of searching, he found her in a small, humble neighborhood where she had taken refuge, trying to start over far from the mansion and far from the pain of feeling like a burden in his life. The reunion was overwhelming. Hearing his voice call her name, she froze, unable to believe he had come so far just to find her. Tears flooded her eyes, mixed with shock and anguish. She tried to run, saying she shouldn't be there, that she didn't belong in his world. But he, firm, held her hand tightly and, even without sight, lifted his face toward her as if he could see her through his heart. And then, with a voice heavy with emotion, he made the declaration she would never forget. I don't need my eyes to know who you are. I see you in the way your voice calms my heart, in the way your hands guide me, in the strength with which you face the world's prejudice. You are the only one who made me smile again, the only one who brought life back to my darkness. I don't want luxury. I don't want beauty that eyes can see. I want you. I want the woman the world insists on despising, but who to me is the most precious of all. She cried, unable to respond. She tried to argue that she wasn't worthy, that her presence only brought him more pain, but he didn't allow her to finish the sentence. Pressing her hand even harder against his chest, he continued, If the world laughs at me, let it laugh. If others judge me, let them judge. I've lived far too long imprisoned by other people's opinions. Today, I see only one truth. I love you, and if you abandon me, then I will truly be blind, because life will have no light. His words broke down the last barriers she had built around her heart. No wealth, no status, no appearance could compete with the burning sincerity of that love. In tears, she finally let herself be wrapped in his embrace, and in that moment, all the prejudice, all the pain, and all the doubts dissolved into something greater, the certainty that they were destined to be together. In that moment, under the curious gazes of passers-by, social differences, appearance, and disability no longer mattered. There was only a man and a woman, united by the strength of a love that refused to be extinguished. The decision to remain together was like a cry of defiance against the world that had judged them so harshly. The millionaire did not hide. On the contrary, he made it a point to make public the feelings he nurtured for her. He gathered friends, distant relatives, and even acquaintances from his past in an event that once seemed impossible, the announcement of his wedding. Rumors spread quickly, and as expected, many reacted with shock and scorn. Some said he had lost his mind. Others claimed she was only interested in his fortune. But deep down, those criticisms were nothing more than masks of a society incapable of accepting that true love does not bend to superficial standards. The wedding day arrived, bringing with it an atmosphere of tension and emotion. The mansion, once marked by silence and darkness, was illuminated with flowers, candles, and soft music. All the employees were present, some still in disbelief, others ashamed for having mocked the woman who was now becoming the lady of the house. She walked down the aisle in a simple dress, yet one filled with meaning. It wasn't the clothing that transformed her, but the newfound confidence etched into every steady step. Her eyes shone with restrained tears, not of fear, but of joy. He, waiting at the improvised altar, was dressed with elegance, but what truly made him imposing was the serenity on his face. As she approached, he extended his hand without hesitation, finding hers with precision, as if he could see her. He held it firmly and smiled, saying in a clear voice for everyone to hear, "Today, I do not see with my eyes. I see with my heart. And before all of you, I choose this woman as my wife, my light, my reason to live." Those words echoed through the hall, like an undeniable truth no one could contest. Some cried with emotion, others fell silent before the strength of that love. And when the yes was spoken, there was no longer any prejudice capable of drowning out the intensity of that moment. The kiss that sealed their union was not only the confirmation of a marriage, but the triumph over all the judgments that had haunted them. In that instant, the mansion ceased to be a symbol of isolation and became the home of a new beginning. She was no longer the invisible, discriminated maid, but the beloved and respected woman, now recognized before everyone as the true keeper of the heart of the man who once believed he was condemned to live in darkness. The wedding was not just a celebration, but the milestone of a new life for the two of them. From that moment on, the mansion that had once been a symbol of loneliness became a home filled with warmth and humanity. The corridors, once silent and cold, were now filled with laughter, voices, and the sound of footsteps that no longer carried heaviness, but hope. The millionaire, who had lost himself in darkness after the accident, now radiated an inner light that did not depend on sight. And that light had a name, a face, a story, the woman he had chosen to love against all odds. She, in turn, experienced an even deeper transformation. For the first time in her life, she truly felt seen. Not as a maid, not as the woman outside society's standards, not as the target of prejudice, but as the wife of a man who loved her for who she was at her very essence. The self-esteem that had once been suffocated by looks of disdain now blossomed in every gesture, in every smile. The confidence she had discovered within herself allowed her to lift her head before any judgment, because she knew she no longer had to prove anything to anyone. The transformation was not only in their private lives, but also in the eyes of the world around them. Many who once mocked them were forced to recognize the strength of that love. The employees who had humiliated her learned to respect her, not for the position she now occupied, but for the dignity with which she had faced every trial. Society, so eager to criticize, could not deny that this couple was a living example that true love does not bow to appearances. Together, they rebuilt dreams. They traveled, laughed, and shared both simple and profound moments. He, even without sight, said he could feel every color through her words and her touch. And she, by his side, discovered that being loved did not mean fitting into standards, but giving herself completely to someone who could recognize invisible beauty. Their love became a legacy, a story told not only in the luxurious halls of the mansion, but also in the humble streets from which she had come. Because every time someone saw her smile, they realized that this humble woman had conquered not only prejudice, but also the fears that had haunted her since the beginning. The end of that journey was not simply a happily ever after. It was proof that true love has the power to heal invisible wounds, to bring life back to tired hearts, and to transform pain into redemption. He, the blind millionaire who believed he was condemned to darkness, and she, the humble maid who believed she was unworthy of love, proved to the world that when two hearts recognize each other, there is no barrier, no appearance, no prejudice capable of keeping them apart.